Hey everybody, I just wanted to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Babble is brought to you by the Great American Novel RPG. It's a role-playing game now on Kickstarter developed by Christopher Gray, who came on Tabletop Babble to talk with me about it. He's the creator of The Happiest Apocalypse on Earth, a game nominated for the 2018 Ennies Product of the Year. The Great American Novel brings a literary framework to role-playing games so that you can play the same dramatic, character-driven experience you find in literature at your table, using a system built entirely around your characters, their motivations, and the conflicts that get in their way. The game can be used for any number of settings. We talked about this on the podcast. It's incredible. You can use it for Avengers if you want to, superhero style stuff. You can go back in time, forward in time, present day, fantasy, sci-fi. They got it all. It is pretty awesome. You can roleplay in the worlds of your favorite novels, films, or television shows, and always have a complete fictional experience with a satisfying conclusion every single session. Look for the Great American Novel on Kickstarter and help make this passion project a reality. Backers will get a complete ready-to-play beta version of the game upon funding. Go to christopher.world for more information. Brought to you by Gallant Knight Games. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, I am talking with David and Tiffany from North by Northquest. It is an incredible podcast. It's a great actual play, and both are amazing storytellers. Both have been game masters on the show, and wow, I just can't wait to dive in and talk with them about storytelling. I do need to make a quick shout out about the show because I got to be a guest on the show, and it was super duper fun. So go check out North by Northquest after you listen to my incredible interview with David and Tiffany. Here it is. Okay, everybody. Now I am here with two of my favorite people, David and Tiffany. Welcome to Tabletop Babble. Tell me, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games? David, let's start with you.
Hello, my name is David Alvord. I am one of the producers and players and GMs and audio editors and kind of a jack of all trades at the North by Northquest podcast. That's kind of where I'm usually found, but we do other stuff around the tabletop community. And through that, that's how I got to know James and how I found myself here today.
I am Tiffany Alvord, so the second half of this duo, and I am also a producer and player and GM and social media and just like a lot of hats for North by Northquest as well, which also I guess brought me here since we got to play with James on the podcast, which was David made the introduction and then I was like, I'm just going to show up and roll dice. Hey.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like we really owe our meeting to Dallas Taylor, who is a podcaster outside the world of tabletop role-playing games, which is great. And it is awesome to be here with both of you. I had such a blast playing on North by Northquest. What a fun game that we put together. And people should go check that out right now on your website, which is northbynorthquest.com. Is that right?
That it is.
Yes. So go check that out. It is really fun. And then go listen to all of the episodes. It's an amazing podcast. There is some great storytelling. Some of the best storytelling in all of podcasting happens on North by Northquest. And that is why I have brought you both here today so we can talk about storytelling in tabletop role-playing games and in podcasts and how it all comes together, because you all do something very interesting on your podcast, something that is extremely hard to do and takes a lot of work, which is you have two parallel stories going on that you interweave. Your stories are not simple. There are twists, there are turns, there are interesting things going on for the players to explore. There's mysteries, and so it is really, really fun to listen to, and everybody is engaging, and at the same time, it's easy to follow, right? And those are two things that I think are hard to achieve, to have this complex plot and then to also have it easy to follow. And it's really important for tabletop role-playing games because your players have so many other things to track, right? They're tracking the story, but then they're also tracking their statistics, and they might be trying to keep a map in their head of the place that they're going through or the world that they're going through and that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about storytelling, and we can dive in, I think, first with like, what do you both think makes an engaging story when it comes to tabletop role-playing games?
For me, I think a lot of it comes down to the characters themselves. So I will say I am a first-time GM, and I decided to first-time GM on a podcast that goes out to the masses, which is an interesting experience, especially since we focus so much on story over game mechanics and really crafting that story. So I will say it's very tricky to figure that out, especially when you're first trying to sort that. And David's done a lot to help me kind of grasp that. But at the end of the day, you have to think about the story for the characters. Because if they aren't invested, if they aren't interested, if there's nothing there that keeps them going through it or wanting to go through it, what even are you doing? Like, it becomes not fun for the players. It's not fun for the listeners. And quite frankly, it's not fun for the GM either if there's no graphs, if there's no interaction. So you can take a huge world-ending multiplanar story, which is what we've got, but it still has to be small and character-driven in the immediate moments. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. I think a lot of shows that have very cool concepts, and I'm thinking about television shows and novels and comic books and games, have these great concepts, and then, the characters are like, Fart Face McGee! And it's just not fun to play with Fart Face McGee or listen to Fart Face McGee.
And it could be if, like, the story was, like, super about him. Like, it became so focused that it was almost like, all right, we're here on this, like, we're on this adventure with Fart Face McGee, like, we're going for it. But if it's like, we're all out in this big scope, like, why do we even care about him? Like, what are we even doing? Because clearly the story's over here. So I think a lot for me, it always comes down to that really fine character detail, those character moments. And I say that for those new GMs too, as I am currently. It's hard sometimes to think that small when you have a big story you want to tell. But if you do take the time to think that small, your players grab onto everything and it sort of runs and writes itself.
Yeah, intimate moments that really show off the characters, I think, are huge. And those are the things that we see memed, right? Those are the things that are pulled out of Critical Role and your favorite television shows and that sort of thing. And those are the moments we think about, like, oh, right, when Superman is explaining this to Lois, it's a peek into his greater worldview and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and Superman's a good example because I used to hate Superman until I read really good Superman comics. And what makes a really good Superman comic is when you focus on him. You don't focus on the big battle, the big Cosmo thing. When you focus on Superman and what makes him work, it's an amazing story. So I think that relates really well.
No, I absolutely agree with everything that Tiffany has just said. It's very interesting to try to build a compelling story that is fun to play, because telling a good story that sucks you in, most people, they can do it for a novel or for TVs or movies, and it's one style, but it's not interactive, so you get to control all the variables. And when you're doing tabletop, you don't get to control those variables. So you need to kind of do it in a way that kind of keeps them a little bit semi on track, but also keeps them wanting to go forward. And what I have found since I started GMing a little over a year ago, is that it takes two kind of sides to it. One is the GM side, which is I want to put a story forward that I am interested to tell for you, that I'm like, okay, in planning it, I enjoy planning it, and I find, oh, when I could do this thing, and it keeps me interested. But then I put it together in a way that the players coming to the table, they find stuff that they're excited to find, whether that might be the classic, oh, I found a cool magic item, or the more fun, here's a twist from your character sheet you didn't think about, but you put it on your character sheet, it's there. Now I'm going to take it and I'm going to turn it on its head, and hello, here you go, deal with it. Those sorts of things get those moments like you're talking about, the memeable moments or the whatever, where they just kind of latch on and you keep joking about it for ages because they just don't see it coming. So focusing on the characters and knowing how a play style of the player playing the character gives you a lot of tools in your arsenal to kind of put something together that, again, you will enjoy playing or planning going forward, because GM fatigue is real. But also your players will look forward to you and email you and text you and everything between sessions, excited with, what's going to happen next? Or they're going to throw out their conspiracy theories at you. Or one of my favorite things with doing this, for a broadcast medium as podcasting is then when you get bigger people at large who are throwing their own thoughts into it, or they're live tweeting it, and you get to watch this unfold. So doing those sorts of things and giving those nuggets for people to think about and kind of play with is what really, to me, kind of drives that compelling story for people to latch on to.
And I think when it comes to those character points, like we're talking a lot from the GM perspective, but from the player perspective, you have to be willing to just say yes to things. You have to be willing to go with the flow of the story. That doesn't mean, oh, I'm presented with this opportunity and my character would never just say yes to it. But that means ask the questions to get your character into the situation, into the perspective of that. Because one of the things that will stop the story and will stop that creative flow is shutting down and saying no and completely derailing what's going on. That's not to say that, like, oh, the DM's railroading you into this thing. That's not really what that means.
Well, what it means is you're saying no and then not engaging with what is given to you. Right. You can say no, but if it's in a manner that makes sense or aligns with your character, go for it. But if you're saying no and then you've disengaged from the scene in front of you, that's what brings you to a halt.
And it brings the entire table to the halt, because now people don't feel like it's an open space to explore the story or to tell the story. Being in that space, it can feel really vulnerable because you're there creating with everyone. And so you get very invested personally. And if someone just says no, it can really feel like a slap to the face, and it makes it hard to keep going. So
especially as a GM who's taken so much time to lovingly craft something to put forward for your enjoyment, and if you come back, it can really sting.
And there's so many ways that you can have your character react accordingly without stopping the story. I had been playing a character who's very no nonsense, who started our campaign very much like, you pay me, I do the job. You don't pay me, I don't do the job. But there's ways to convince them. There's ways to be like, no, I don't think this is a great idea, and then be talked into it. So you're always, in the end, saying yes to the story prompt and moving forward without completely sacrificing your character.
Sure, yeah. And evolution, too, I think is a big part of stories. When we read a story or when we watch a story, there's an arc. We always talk about the arc, the hero's journey, the yada yada. And you see characters develop. And I think there's something that is fun about playing that mercenary character who's very Han Solo at the beginning of Star Wars, who then becomes a general for the Rebel Alliance by the end of the, original trilogy. And so there's looking for those opportunities too as a player, I think is huge. Even if it's a one shot, to say, how does my character change from this one crazy adventure, right? How many of us have in real life, a near-death experience, like a health scare or something like that then puts us on a different path. Like, oh man, I had a heart attack. Now it's time to eat more salads or whatever,
Yeah, and I was going to say that even as a GM, it's fun to actually throw that in their face sometimes. What I found is you can throw this big, like let's say a large battle or a very jarring experience just happened to the party, and then 2 seconds later, after seeing this NPC they've traveled with for 10 months just murdered in front of them that they've grown close, and they're just like, okay, let's go get popcorn. Well, you can kind of as a GM be like, well, now you just kind of took that a little lighter than I kind of expected, and then once they start to think about it, then it's kind of like, yeah, you can. How would you react if you just had a good friend of yours like killed in front of you or stuff like that? And that growth, that change, that evolution over time to see reactions and how the story has molded a character really is what keeps all of it fresh.
Yeah, very true. It's very true. And one of the things that I think I love to see is the character development of the characters at the table learning each other and saying like, oh, okay, now that we've seen this is one way to entice you to come on this adventure that doesn't involve money, how do we amp that up? How do we continue to use that sort of hook to bring you in? And at what point does your character then realize, hey, you're just manipulating me into stuff, right?
I think there's lots of ways to do that, both for the players with each other, but also for the GM. I'll say my character that I had played through our volume 2, Val, she was kind of that, she wasn't a mercenary, but she was very much like a sellsword, like I do the job, you pay the job, like a very no nonsense. And she was our fighter, so she was very much that gruff, not big talker kind of character. And as we kept going, she kept getting softer and softer and kind of cared more for people. And one of the things we knew since I was going to be taking over GMing is that I couldn't be a player character and GM. So we came up with a really compelling story for Val. And part of that was making her care about people and care about the world and have that turn. And one of the ways David did that as the GM, he did get my permission. So players, your GM can get your permission for things. He came to me and he was like, would you be okay if I essentially maimed your character, if like she has something happen that physically doesn't heal? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, let's go for it. That sounds, we come from it from a entertainment perspective. I'm like, that sounds cool. Let's do it. And he took my eye in a really cool, amazing scene. But then it's like, what I was given from that point is basically a quest, a title for the world. In exchange, they took my eye. It's like, now you're invested here. And I did. I think I spent the next 4 episodes being like, y'all, we are doing this. They took my eye. Do you see what I went through for this? Like, we're saving these people. You don't have to take all your players' eyes, but there's ways that you can narratively add that and assist that change. So it's not just the player having to figure it out. There's ways to do that in story. On top of your fellow characters and your fellow players' interaction and them helping push that too.
Yeah, I think sacrifice is a thing that can come up in games even by accident, right? Or not by accident, but by roll of the dice. I think of a game that I was playing where we were on this mission. A friend, NPC, who had been turned into a monster was traveling with us, and we were on a quest to turn them back into not a monster. And 2 of our friends died halfway through this mission. And then all of a sudden it becomes like, well, yeah, it's more dangerous, but we need to complete this now, right? Like 2 of the party have died. If we don't do this, what did they die for? And I think taking those things to heart and having it be more than just like, hey, Peter's character died, haha, isn't that great? They have to re-roll a new character. It gives not just your story more purpose and your characters more purpose, it also then helps that player whose character died feel like their death had more meaning, right? Like, that's a cool moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because a lot of people will bring up the Adventure Zone Balance arc, which is a very good story that a lot of people have really enjoyed. And they'll talk to us about how like, oh, we see some parallels between, your kind of podcast and that kind of podcast. I'm like, okay, cool. But then we start to talk and we say, well, we like to try to give it a lot more grounded feel. And when you do stuff like the sacrifice, or you have those moments that come out of left field that you don't expect, that are like an emotional punch in the gut, it makes you as a listener, it makes you as a player or a GM or a character way more vested. And then it makes the payoff, whether it's a good payoff, like they actually completed the quest, or if everybody died, but they died in a blaze of glory, it makes it so much more memorable and impactful. And you just, that investment, even though it's a hard thing, I feel is always really worth it.
Well, there's that whole idea in writing of kill your darlings. Don't be afraid of character death. And I understand we all play these characters, and sometimes you play them for years, and having that character die in the story can be really gut-wrenching. But I think instead of being mad about that, I think it's a really cool moment that you can embrace within role play. Both the party can deal with it. Oh my goodness, this person just died. Like, what do we do? We can't let them die in vain, or like all of that. But also you as a player, you get to kind of experience that emotional investment for the story. And I mean, yeah, okay, we can re-roll a new character, but now it's almost cool coming in as a new character with this party that had that happen. And how does that affect gameplay now? How does that change your view through the story coming in now as a new person? And it's part of why when Critical Role this current season they're on, they had Molly Mock die, and the fan base went insane about it. And I think, one, it's really cool to see that a character resonates with so many people. Yes. Like, the story's so strong that people are devastated by this character's death. But at the same time, I do really admire the Critical Role cast of being like, hey, yeah, we get it. We're upset. Like, we're sad too, but like, let's use this for the story. Let's use this as a way to move forward.
And even Matt Mercer kind of echoed what we just said, was like, this is the reality of not only the game, but the story, and it gives purpose and meaning and stakes to those going through this quest. And what I've also found interesting is, especially when you make, whether it's sacrifice or it's a key death like that, kind of not straightforward, it becomes interesting. And what I mean by that is, at the end of volume 2, which we finished a few months ago, I had specifically crafted our big bad for that volume to be a ambiguous villain. And so it was very much kind of shown off leading up to that point in a way that it's like he is the villain and he's pulling these strings. And then at the very end of the story, you realize, oh, wait a second. And there's this big turn that makes it like completely nebulous if he truly was a bad guy or if the party was the bad guy. And what happened was, after they killed him, we would get stuff like, one of my favorite moments was after that episode aired, Elizabeth, one of our players on the show, her mom loves to listen and she gives us all this great commentary. I love her mom's commentary. It's one of my favorite things. And like, we got this litany of questions about like her theories about, well, he's a bad guy. Well, maybe he's a good guy. Maybe he deserved a chance. Why didn't you talk to him? Why did you kill him? Like, and that's like putting it there and making them confront it. And then like subsequently the engagement you get from those who enjoy that thing, it really is rewarding. And it shows that it does resonate when you do those kind of sacrifices, planned or not, when you plan them correctly.
Ambiguity, I think, is a really cool thing to play with. Because let's be honest, like, how often do you walk through your day with anyone you come into contact with being like, they're good, they're evil? Like, everyone has facets to them. At one moment, I could make a choice where David's like, that's a really idiotic choice, but to me, it makes perfect sense. So I think playing with that within both your character, your party, your game, your story, no matter if it's the villain or an NPC, just that gray space is a really cool place to play in. And I think it tells some of the most compelling stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that there are ways you can do things where, when you look at things from like, we've got this war between the orcs and the elves, and then, when you look at things from the orc perspective, they kind of make sense. And maybe the elves are being a little too harsh over here. But then again, on the other hand, and so you're able to place the players in some interesting conflict that way, not just with each other, but with their own sort of values where maybe they need to make a tough call, which is always fun to watch and fun to role play.
I come from a theater background, and I was stage managing a show in college, and one of our actors was playing this really kind of a scumbaggy character. Like, he was clearly the villain of the play, and he was like, I don't know how to play this. I can't connect to this, like, because it's just awful. Like, how do I do this? And the director looked at him and was just like, he doesn't see himself as the villain. You can't play a villain. Because to him, he's right. He's the hero of his story. So you have to play him as a person. Like, because, we all we watch the play. We're like, he's a scumbag. Like, he's terrible. But you, the actor, can't think like that, or you're going to read like a Looney Tune villain. You have to understand that even the villain thinks they're right.
Well, I mean, look, again, going back to what we were talking about briefly earlier, look at Black Panther. A lot of people said Killmonger was a very relatable villain because they were said, like, I can see exactly why he's doing that and where he's coming from. And a lot of people were like, I don't think he's wrong. Like, of course, yes, he did some bad stuff. But the point was, it wasn't just Dr. Doom being Dr. Doom to be Dr. Doom. It was something that was very much, I could see myself doing that.
And it makes the players sweat about it.
Oh, yeah. Make your players agonize. Absolutely.
Hey, everybody, wanted to take a quick break to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Kobold Press. Want to learn the secrets of elven magic? Blast your enemies with battle magic? Build cunning mechanical servants with clockwork magic? The Deep Magic series from Kobold Press has all this and more. Time magic, rune magic, illumination, nearly 20 PDFs with new ones coming out all the time. In this series, you'll find new schools of magic, sorceress origins, warlock patrons, feats, spells, magic items, and so much more. Kobold Press makes amazing products, and Deep Magic is no exception. Everything is play tested, everything comes with beautiful art, and each PDF is extremely affordable. Every single one is a deal. Pick up the Deep Magic series for 5th edition at www.koboldpress.com. That's koboldpress.com. Tell them Don't Split the Podcast Network sent you. All right, back to the show. As GMs, then, how do you prep for stories like this? Stories that are gray, stories that are going to draw the characters in, but then also have the freedom for the characters to play around and surprise you as the GM. Like, how do you create a story? How much prep should we be doing, and where should we be doing it?
Yeah, that is a loaded question. Well, let me preface my answer, at least, with a little bit of a quick background on how our podcast is structured, because it presents different challenges depending on where we're talking about. Our first volume there was no side quest. It was primarily a party of 3 to 4 with the main characters, and there was a GM. Nothing. It was a straightforward, normal table, we'll say. The second volume, we had 2 players start, and then we brought 2 new players in halfway through. So you're introducing the new players, and then you have a side story, our first side quest, where you had 1 player and 1 GM. And so it was a one-on-one game. And then now that we're in our third volume, we have a different main party, which is the same characters, but in a different combination. And then a different side quest, which is actually going to collide with the main quest, in a few months. And so planning for the first volume versus the second, or the second side quest versus the third and the third side quest, are all completely different situations. So the first thing is, whenever you're planning for these kind of things, sit and think about what kind of table are you playing with. Some like crunchy, some like role play. Some want to get a big like, I call it like the set piece 1980s action feel, and some want to just stay and play Animal Crossing in D&D. So first, know a little bit about your players, and you get that from your session 0. But then what I find out is, once you know a little bit about the characters that they're playing and about them, This is how I approach it. Let me preface it with that. This is how I like to approach it is, if we're telling a long story for multiple sessions, I like to have very large story beats, 3, 4, 5, just like here are the big things I would like to see them eventually do. And those will change because your players are spontaneous, but it gives you at least a way to keep your mind thinking a little bit ahead to prepare for them changing. And then when I show up for a game day, I say, okay, here's, depending on how long the game day is, 2 to 3 or 4 to 6, depending on the length of the game. Like here are the main kind of, I call them in my head literally scenes, like the different situations or whatever you want to put them through. And then you approach with that kind of framework, but you don't overly detail it. You know, these are kind of the direction I think it's going to go. And then you give yourself also the picture of what's just outside of that. So when they deviate, you have at least a vibe for where the first step outside each of those can go. And then you kind of basically play off of them when you get to the table. And that happened a lot this weekend when we did our Save the Shop stream, and we did 3 games back to back with the same prompt. All 3 games started with the same prompt in a plan for their table, and every one of the tables went off the rails. So, if you don't over constrain yourself, because you're never going to stick 100% to the plan.
I will say that when it comes to kind of prepping, it's a really good idea to have a solid foundation of what the world is, what the environment is like, what the people are like, what kind of things they want. And I say that because I went into volume 3 not having that fully fleshed out, and it's very hard. So while I don't think you have to do a crazy amount of prep work, having that foundation laid for yourself makes it a lot easier to be spontaneous and a lot easier to go into a session with not as much planned, because you have that base of kind of how the world operates, how people within the world operate. So I would say that's probably where more of the prep work should hit outside of those kind of just story beats. We typically work within kind of a 3 arc structure. We kind of have the beginning part, we get in, we get our quest, we start going. The middle part that leads into our culmination, and then we have the end portion. So really using that 3-section story arc has worked really well for us. If you can know your world, if you can understand the foundation that everyone's playing with, I don't think you have to do nearly as much game prep for each individual session than you might think you do. And again, I say that from pure experience of not having done that fully beforehand and getting caught very off guard and realizing that I myself as a GM wasn't as happy because I felt more flustered than I needed to. And while the players still had a great time at the table, if you aren't feeling confident, if you aren't having fun, it makes it a lot harder to want the next session, to want to sit down and game, no matter how much you love the people you're gaming with.
Oh, yeah. And that's why, for me personally, I typically find that I do a significant amount more planning. Again, this is kind of for homebrew stuff, not running from modules, but I do a significantly higher amount of planning going into my first game or 2 of a campaign or a story or whatever than any subsequent game, because I am asking those questions. Volume 2 was in a post-apocalyptic world, and literally the first question I asked before any planning was, well, how did the apocalypse come about here? Why? What led to it? What caused it? And I asked all those questions, how did we get to this place before I even put pencil to paper on what kind of game are we playing? Because then when I said, I want them to do this, or they do this thing, what could happen? I at least know what led to here, and I can adjust much easier to what they do.
And that's not to say you have to know every nook and cranny and have the map fully fleshed out and every NPC. Like, you just have to have the basics. You have to have the main structure. Obviously, if you're working from a module, that's there for you to read. So read your module, make notes.
And do whatever you're comfortable with.
Exactly. But since we homebrew all of our settings, it takes a lot more of that initial prep work to lay the foundation of the world, to understand kind of where you're playing, so that when you roll into a session and your players do something completely off the wall, like go hunting for lizard heads, you're fine with it.
Well, you're fine with it. The GM might be fuming, but you're fine with it.
They were great lizard heads.
But I think it also speaks to the fact that you should be fine with whether you're running a prepared module or something that you've created. Nothing exists in the world until you talk about it to your players, right? Or until your players talk about it to you. So if you as a player think like, well, this is a thing that I have in my backstory, and then decide, oh, you know what? It might be more interesting if I tied this element of my backstory directly into what we're doing, you know? Or if you as a GM, the classic, you're sitting there and your players are spitballing all of the terrible things you're planning, and you say, oh, this idea is much better than the actual terrible thing I had planned. Let me steal that, you know? There are all kinds of things that if you are willing to let go of a little bit of your prep or not treat a module as gospel, your world really opens up a lot. And then you have the safety net of your prep to go back to. And also, I often find prep is never wasted if you can find a way to use it in another session, right? So, hey, you didn't go into this cave filled with goblins. Guess what? Now it's filled with hobgoblins, and everything else is exactly the same, and you're going in there at a little bit later level, and it's all good. You know, I still get to use this map I drew, that sort of thing.
And I think what's important to remember is that you can always move what you wanted to a different place. So nothing that's in your notes is set in stone. Nothing that's in the module is set in stone. So if you're like, it's really important for them to get this item or get this information or do this thing, and they miss the initial hook, well, just move the hook. Like, just give it to them in a different way. I originally was going to have our party meet an NPC one way, and then they went off a different path. So I was like, well, I guess they're going to come in over here. And so I just had them run into the party in a different way. So they still get what they need, but it doesn't feel like you force them into one place, or that if they don't get to that exact door and this exact alley in this exact moment, they miss it.
Yeah, I mean, because definitely if you try to stop the players and force them to do whatever hook or trigger it is, no one's having fun. You're kind of ruining the suspension of disbelief. You're breaking that trust a little bit at the table. It just kind of grinds to a halt. I mean, it's much better to say you're in a room, there's a north, south, east, and west exit. And even if you only had planned west, east, and south, and everybody says, oh, we're going to the north exit. Well, instead of saying, I don't have anything planned, just turn your map upside down and you get to go. It's not wasted. You just adjust it, and that is much better than you being like, well, no, I mean, suddenly there's a force field there where I use the thing. Well, that doesn't work. Like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything's movable, and be willing to listen to your players, because they will always come up with stuff that you can tug on again later or use. It's always really fun to have something you throw out then be grabbed onto as a conspiracy theory, and then to tweak that again and pretend it was the plan all along.
Yeah. Well, and I really do think what we said earlier about being a DM and hearing a player say no is also true the opposite way around, right? Being a player and saying, I want to try X, and being told, no, flat out, you cannot even try it. There's an invisible force field. That is just as much a slap in the face and feels just as bad. Whereas rolling a 1.
Well, that's a different matter. You walked bad,
right?
At that point. You walked in the wall and not the door, and that's your own fault.
Now, if you have advantage and you roll 2 1s, then I guess you just fall through the floor and you're done with the quest. But
that's right. That's sadvantage, and it is a different feeling of failure that you experience.
Yeah. Yeah, but definitely if you play and your GM's just like, no, there's that moment in all of us, because we're all stubborn creatures, that it's just like, well, then what's the point? Like, you're ready to table flip and walk out. So don't table flip
And the reason that, James, I gave you a hard time when you guessed it is because there's a running joke in our household that Tiffany, when given something, whether she's supposed to or not, she latches onto it and she's like a little raccoon with like a little shiny thing. And if you try to take it away from her, she'll hiss at you. And so it's like the same thing with your players, whether you mean for that NPC to be of interest or not, or whether you mean to not have this thing, they're going to find the thing you didn't plan for and they're going to latch on it and they don't care what you say because that is now their best friend.
Or their worst enemy.
Or, yes.
Because we definitely, in the same game where we went off for search of lizard heads and David was not impressed with us, we started we have a vendetta against the inn owner after that. So we were like against him at all points moving forward.
Because that's a good point I don't think we've mentioned, or I hear many people mention, is when you are playing a game, of course in real life time passes, but in game time passes as well. And the reason I think that the two of you got so frustrated was you go to this inn. So I'll give you the short version. You go to the inn and it's like, okay, you try to basically con your way into having a room for the night and your cons don't work out. Okay. And then you're like, well, we're pissed. We're going to go do this thing. And he's like, all right, well, yeah, good luck or whatever. And he kind of
we side quested.
Yeah. So you invented your little side quest and you go do it. And you get let to do that. But what happens is time passes while you do that. And the expectation that when you return, everything is as before does not have to hold. So you can come back. And if the last room of the night that you were trying to con your way or side quest yourself in got sold to someone with actual money, then that spurs on further reactions. You don't have to keep characters in your game static. You don't have to keep things the same. Time passes. And so people can move around or a tree can fall or any of that sort of stuff. And that unexpected, like, oh, I just expected to go back to the tavern and everything was the same. And well, no, a keg kind of fell over and now it's closed for the day because you can't get in there because it's broken. Like those things that are unexpected.
Consequences.
Yeah. Like that's how life is. And so it feels more real to you as a player.
And we loved it. We definitely white girl raged because it was funny and we were having a great time. And our vendetta against the innkeeper became like a standing thing. It was part of our character motivation at that point, but we were never like actually mad about it.
Sure.
But like, so consequences for what players do is really important. We robbed a bank and then we left the town and then we came back. Well, we got arrested because we were the only new people and the bank got robbed. Like, it makes total sense. Val will tell you to this day we allegedly robbed a bank because she's gaslighting the entire town about it, but that's neither here nor there. We still got arrested for robbing a bank.
Right. But don't be afraid to challenge your players, whether it's changing things up or whether it's doing that there are consequences to your actions, good or bad, or whether you add just a little bit of randomness and unexpected to just going through it, even if it's something you don't expect. Like maybe you've got a table of like, here's 5 random nature things that could happen. And you're like, oh, I just feel like throwing something in there. And suddenly, oh, a monsoon. Oh, hey, guess what? Here comes a monsoon and now deal with it. Like that spur of the moment thing can really mix it up. And what I also found in that same, that volume 2 story was, it might've been the next episode. I actually put them on a train. And then what happened was I made them do this thing, but I timed them. Like I didn't put the timer in front of them. I was going to, but basically like I forced the tempo of the table. So if you remember growing up with like Mario side scrollers, those levels that put you on a slow move and you can't move around it, it adds to being the like tense and it adds to the investment of the table, and then the players feel that and they react off each other, and so it comes across for everybody. So feel free to experiment.
That might have been the most tense I have ever been in a fictional game in my life.
Oh wow.
Like a bomb went off, we had to stop this train. We had to slow it. We were in a land with no magic. Like we had to figure this out. And yeah, Chelsea and I just like, we went for it. And David gave us kind of a time frame in the game. He did not put an actual timer in front of us, which is probably good. I might have table flipped if he had put a legit timer in front of me. But like we were intense about it. It was the most go role playing we had really done in the world so far. And I think both of us, like when we finished, we were just like, my heart is pounding, like I'm sweaty. Like that wasn't even a real train. I almost cried over a
Wow.
fake sword. Like, what is happening right now?
That's incredible. And that's immersion right there, right? That you were truly immersed in the story, which is great, masterful storytelling and ways to keep the tension up. And anything like that you can do to immerse people is huge. We're talking a lot about improvising and prep and that sort of thing. And we need to talk about the unique fact that North by Northwest does have these two storylines that are going to collide, both starring Barry Firstep, probably
played by one of the best players out there in the game today.
And of course, really starring Jasper, as we all know.
People are already begging for Jasper merch. You have nailed it.
You're welcome. You're welcome, by the way.
You get 5% on the back end. It's all good.
But you do. You have these two stories that are colliding. And how much of that is, obviously I know it's hard because you're playing in games and you don't want to give away things, you don't want your players to hear. But how much prep is going into it in sort of vague terms? How much prep is going into it? How much is that prep changing? How much of the back end do you kind of have figured out, for lack of a better term? What is going on and how many things are happening that you think, oh, I could tie this in and now I could tie this in, and all of a sudden you've got a complex web of things.
Right. Too many. Although, let me preface that answer with the fact that on top of it, we also rotate GMs. Mm-hmm. So you deal with different people at the helm for each story. So it's not even just at the end of Volume 3 and Volume 3 side quests, they collide together. It's, oh, by the way, when we start Volume 4, you're going to have a different person at the helm.
Right.
So you get creative.
So one of the things that we do a little differently than most Dungeons & Dragons podcasts is that we group plan the large story. So every one of us gets together and we plan what's the big overarching theme that we're telling. What are the really big beats we want to hit in this volume and the overall point. So all of us, as we come and sit down at the table, no matter what we're playing, we all have an idea of kind of where we're going with the big picture.
From the highest of levels. So really nothing that's a episode specific impact, but from the, in a year from now, where's the story kind of going to possibly be, right. Sort of just so we can be on, maybe we're on this half of the compass and not the whole compass in terms of which direction it might go.
Right. So we look at, okay, how many volumes are we doing? We're doing this many. Okay, what's the overarch that we want for these volumes? What big story do we want to tell? And then from that point, we have our GMs for those volumes kind of work together to plan what the beats for those volumes are. And I will say this takes a little bit of trusting that the other people are able to not metagame since we do so much collaborative planning. So David and I are in the unique position of both being GMs right now and also both being players. So I GM for him in the main volume, and then he GMs for me in the side quest. And so it takes a lot of trust to know that the other person's not going to roll into the game and just like kick everything down and shoehorn it all and not be their character. But we've been going for 2 years now, so we've gotten pretty okay at it. But we sit and I will say he probably has done more to help me with planning Volume 3 just because I know my strengths and my weaknesses with GMing especially. But we really get into just those points. What's the arc look like? And we leave the episode-specific details to the individual GM. So while he might know that we're going to do a vision at one point, or we're going to pull on these threads, he's not going to know exactly how I'm going to present it to them, or all of I'm bringing in hobgoblins this game. Like, we don't necessarily share those really minute details, but we do talk about the overarching story arc.
Right. And that's only with me. So when Joe or Elizabeth or Chelsea roll in, they don't know any of that stuff. So really, at the moment, for example, Tiffany will confide in me in a few things to make sure we're kind of on the same page. But even I usually say the level is we all 5 of us, all 6 of us, we all know 1% of the final story. 3 of us know 5%, and then one player, whoever, like in this case, myself or Tiffany, will know like 10%. And the remaining 90%, the actual real, get in their gameplay, only Tiffany or only that GM knows. It's also interesting because now you're doing the main quest and I'm doing side quest. I try to pull on things from the previous volumes, or I say, hey, I'm like, for example, I had this guy Barry come in and I want Barry to be tied in this way and that way. And so in main quest, a few episodes later, after the people listening get to meet Barry and Jasper, then there's a shout out to this wood elf with a raccoon. And then people are like, oh, that's Barry. And then they're like, oh, that's Barry. And then like they have all the thoughts that go along with Barry and Jasper. And so you kind of share pieces that can kind of go back and forth, but you have to, and in my case, so I don't spoil it for Tiffany because she is a player in side quest as well, I will sometimes go to Chelsea. She's another one of the players, and I'm like, hey, Chelsea, I know you've kind of, some of this stuff and you got some planning. Let me bounce a couple ideas off you, because she's not sitting at that game table. And so she can be a sounding board, and then I can be like, oh man, that would work great this way. And then I can go back and I can plan it out, and then that's how I run y'all off the road.
Yeah, and Chelsea DM'd our volume 2 side quest. So we have this library that's both a place but a really big character in the story. So she developed a lot of that lore during that side quest. So the 3 of us have sat down to really talk through that and to really make sure all of us kind of are on the same page. And
right, well, because the library is kind of the glue that holds our entire story together. And so we wanted to make sure that the lore developed that for that specifically was something that we all, like we said before, if you have a good feel for the kind of world you're about to put your players in to experience, you can do better. So in this case, we said everything else be damned, as long as the 3 of us feel really solid about basically the rules and the feel of what the library is doing, then everybody can do the other things easier.
Right, exactly. So yeah, we do a lot of group brainstorming and kind of group planning, but we do leave a lot still to our individual GMs because we like that randomness. We like that surprise. From the start, we were like, if we didn't want that improv, if we didn't still want that game portion of it, we would just write a scripted audio drama.
Yeah, like forget that. Yeah. And I don't want it to sound like we all sit down and we all know everything that's going on, and so we just show up and act. Elizabeth will accuse me quite oftenly, since I'm the audio editor. Well, Jode helps now with SideQuest. Praise him. He is my favorite person ever for that. But because audio editing takes a lot of time. But Elizabeth will give me a hard time because many episodes we'll put out there, and we are all a big fan of our own show. And so we all love listening, and we'll all excitedly chat about it again. And she's like, where did that come from? I didn't know that was a scene. We didn't play that at the table. I was like, yeah, we filmed that cool side scene with like James or with like something else. So we put it in there, and it's another twist for their characters that they got to experience away from the table. And so it pulls it together. And one of the things I thought was cool, going back to your developing the library thing, was we also did that not to have everybody on the same page only, but also because we came up with SideQuest to do like for volume 2. That was when I took over as GM as main quest, and I said, but I like to play. Can I play?
We did start side quests to make sure you could still play.
And well, it wasn't just like it wasn't for my ego or anything, but what it was like, well, we all like playing, but also the GM fatigue, and said, well, if we do these 2 stories in parallel, we can explore more of the world. I can play, we can do all this stuff. And then we sat down from a logistics standpoint and we said, well, why don't we do one-on-one? And so what was super cool was once we decided we could do 2 stories in parallel and show these back and forths, and we can like start crossing over, and we can have these like intermingled things, kind of like when you see in the MCU when all the different ones come together, like it's always cool to see them show up. We realized that by doing a one-on-one story for the volume 2 side quest was a really unique opportunity, both for me as a player, and I'm sure Chelsea as a GM, and then for the listeners, because what it did was it gave us a pure spotlight on the where we were, like the library. And so the lore that was developed was front and center. And then my character, Pascal, like he had a very firm quest. And so he got this, like, you got to watch a real deep dive for a character, which was really interesting because Chelsea would throw these different things that would both enhance everybody's understanding of the library and see where it was going and see its history, while simultaneously seeing Pascal develop through his quest on this. And so getting to do that one-on-one planning and gaming and story was just really satisfying. So when we got towards, I'd say, 2/3 of the way through volume 2, and we said, all right, well, let's get an idea of what we want to do about volume 3. Do we continue this or whatever? It went from a do we to an immediate, yes, we love this. We want to keep doing this. Like, so volume 4 will have a side quest as well. And we realized, like, each one is going to have a different flavor because the longer we do this, the longer we recognize we are an experimental tabletop podcast. We do things that they may not work out, but they've been working out pretty well from time to time. And we try these things. And so like the volume 4 side quest will be a different approach than either the previous two. So like taking that and saying, how can we, like in my mind, these, I mean, even the book version of the D&D universe as written by a module is 12 planes or whatever. And it's a multiplanar thing and a huge universe. And I look at our world homebrewed the same way. It's a multiplanar, multi-universe. You have like actual planes, you have pocket dimensions, you have all these different things. And so you've got a big place, like a place to play. So why would you take the exact same storytelling approach to look at every single one? Why not change it up a little and take a different approach and kind of play to that area's strengths and try something different? And you know what? If it doesn't work, oh well, you tried, you learned, and you do something different going forward. And when you kind of you take that leap of faith and you jump in with that, I have found it's become so much more rewarding for any of the stuff we do.
Yeah, and really, at the end of the day, we look at it from the story point of view. It made a lot of sense going into volume 2 that the side quest would happen and that it would be Pascal, a one-on-one story. And then we came into volume 3 and we're like, well, that doesn't make sense anymore. So what can we do that's different? And the volume 3 side quest is going to directly impact volume 3's end because they're going to come straight together. They're going to directly impact each other. And then it's okay as we move into our current idea for volume 4, what we're looking at right now, because we do plan kind of bigger. What's going to make the most sense there? How do we change this format to work for the story and to tell something interesting and make it all work, but keep the idea that they're all tied together? And I will say we do have an end in sight. I think it's really important to have an end in sight for your stories.
Absolutely. It's a point that people have disagreed with us before on. Everybody has their own opinion, but we feel kind of like we said earlier tonight about how sacrifice or character death or things like that really make you more vested in your story. If you have a campaign, you can run a 10-year campaign and everybody will be happy. And I'm thoroughly excited and I'm glad you get fulfillment in that and seeing the evolution both in your life and at the table. But from a podcasting standpoint here, we made that decision like not day one, but pretty much day one, and said, look, if we have a finite end, if there is a book end that we say we are going to do X amount and we're going to tell this story and be done there, kind of like with like some of the great novels out there that you've seen before, if they just keep going and going and going, ad infinitum, it kind of like, after the 15th book or whatever, but you're like, oh, I know there's only X number of volumes and you're going through it and you're binge listening or you're reading through it. You can feel it and it raises the stakes, and as a player, this has an end one way or another. And as a listener, this is not going to keep on going. These characters have to have a final point, and it really adds to that, what you get out of the whole experience, whether you're at the table, planning the table, or just listening.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for having an end in sight, and I think it also helps you avoid burnout and fatigue, especially because you can always start a new thing, right? You can always start a new journey that is always exciting and interesting as well. And I look forward to your Infinity War in Volume 4.
So when you come back every week and join us as Barry rises and destroys however many people.
Exactly. So, but I really, really appreciate what you're doing. I think what you're doing is special and magical, and people should definitely check out your podcast. If they want to do that, where should they go and what should they do?
Perfect. Yeah, you can find us on all of the podcast players out there. It's North by Northquest. You can go to northbynorthquest.com, and we're on all the social medias as NXN Quest.
Excellent. And how about individually? Do you all have Twitter handles and or cosplay pages you want to shout out?
I do indeed. You can find me on all the social medias as well as RTS Cosplay. It stands for Rattle the Stars Cosplay. I do a lot of sewing and a lot of making, and hopefully sometime this year you might see some character cosplays of our own podcast characters.
Ooh, that is awesome.
Specifically mine, maybe a Pascal.
Excellent. David, where can people find you?
I am not nearly as active as my beautiful wife, but if you do want to follow me in my random musings, I am on Twitter at RocketArt, ROCKIT_art. And I have to shout out for a quick second, James. We were lucky enough to be introduced through our now mutual friend Dallas Taylor, who's wonderful. And as a nice aside, actually in a recent episode, well, the current episode as of this taping, it'll be recent when this is released. My day job, I actually did an episode on 20,000 hertz. So in the current episode, I met with Dallas and we spoke on sound and silence, and he actually got to tour some of our anechoic chambers at work. So if you want to know about sound and some of my passion about audio in general, the current episode or recent episode, depending when you're listening, on silence, I actually speak from my day job.
The episode is actually called Silence.
That's awesome. It is a great podcast. I actually write and produce some of the episodes for it. I did not write and produce the Silence episode, but it is a super fun and awesome podcast that everybody should check out. And the Silence episode is good stuff. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today here on Tabletop Babble.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was a great conversation with David and Tiffany. You know, Tabletop Babble is still a fairly new show, and you can help us grow by heading on over to iTunes and leaving us a 5-star review. Seriously, even if you're not listening through the iTunes app, odds are your podcatcher uses the iTunes algorithms to rate and recommend podcasts to other people. So, please go leave us a review. It's free to make an account, and it only takes a minute of your time. We'll appreciate it, and so will every other podcast. Plus, if you leave us a 5-star review, I will read it out loud and credit the person who left it. You can make me say anything you want, like Ian Loves Haley, who left a review entitled Dedicated. Ian, first of all, if you haven't been listening to Tabletop Babble, Ian is an incredible fan of the show who has also been a guest on the show, an incredible game master, a great player. It is an honor to have this review from Ian, and here are his words. I love this podcast so much, I am using my wife's account to write this 5-star review. Side note from me. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Ian's wife. If you want to listen to a podcast with the best RPG conversations, Tabletop Babble is it. Also, just because James has to read this, Haley is the best wife ever. Rosalie is the best daughter ever. And everyone come out to a catacon this November in Dayton, Ohio. Don't Split the Podcast might even be there running some epic games. Shout out to the crew that took down the behemoth. Last of all, thanks, James, for your dedication to the hobby and the positivity you bring to it. Ian, thank you for the dedication you bring to the hobby and the positivity you bring to it for this review and just for being an awesome dude and friend. Thank you so much. All right, people, if you want to find out more about what I'm doing, I'm at James Introcaso on Twitter, and I'm over at worldbuilderblog.com. Also, head on over to Don't Split the Podcast Network and check out The Demon Plague. It's a 5th edition actual play podcast that I am running. It is based on a level 1 through 20 adventure that I wrote with John Four that you can go pick up right now. It's on drive-thru. It's at roleplayingtips.com/Demon Plague. So go check that out if you want a level 1 through 20 D&D adventure. And also check out the podcast at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Lots of awesome people. Rudy Basso, Lauren Urban, TK Johnson, Robert Aducci. We got great guests. Awesome guests like Samwise Gamgee is on there. Okay. Dan Dillon is on there. Pretty awesome dude. We've also had Amber on there, who is pretty great. So go check it out at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Don't forget, RPGs are like sex. Hey everybody, just wanted to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Babble was brought to you by Elderwood Academy. Elderwood Academy are artisans crafting amazing gaming products including dice towers, dice trays, dice boxes, deck boxes, dice, and so much more. All of their products are handcrafted to look like spell books, scroll cases, codexes, and other awesome fantasy gear that you will love. I have many Elderwood products and I always get big time compliments on them at the table. They are the most beautiful gaming products that I own. Now, what I want you to do is head on over to the Elderwood website right now. Okay, go to elderwoodacademy.com/don't split. That's elderwoodacademy.com/don't split. It's really important you get that don't split in there so they know that we sent you. Okay, so head on over elderwoodacademy.com/don't split, and you're going to check out all of the awesome products that they have. All right. I'm talking about scroll trays. I'm talking about dice towers. There's all kinds of fun stuff. But here's what I want you to look at today. I want you to look at the Dice Catapult Kit. Yeah, that's right. It is a awesome little kit that you can make some wood, some rubber bands, and you can use it to launch dice at your friends at the table. Don't like what your dungeon master said? Boom. Hit them in the face with a D20 using this Dice Catapult Kit. All right. Thank you very much to Elderwood Academy for sponsoring us and for making this beautiful dice catapult.